just a quick intro to the next section that I'm going to read. It takes place in Tonopah, which is a very small town, kind of in the middle of Nevada. Um, Most of what I described is real, like the Mizpah is a real hotel there. And there's a cemetery down the road and so on. It's an encounter between Rachel and her mother, and just to be clear, one of the major themes of the novel is that Rachel is searching for who she is. Her parents are divorced, which to her is a stigma. She's like the only kid whose parents are divorced. She has very little contact with her father. He lives back in New York. Uh, Occasional phone calls. Her father is Jewish. Her mother is not. People think she's Jewish, but she'll say, "Well, I'm not Jewish because her mother has to be Jewish." So she has this whole identity thing that she's going on, trying to figure out who she is, and knows almost nothing about her mother's past other than that her mother grew up in an orphanage. Um, so those are some of the things that are addressed in this. So I went down and had French toast and sausages with extra syrup. Then I walked around Tonopah, but almost everything was closed. The trees were leafless. In Las Vegas, the trees had come out 6 weeks ago, and the yards and sidewalks were muddy. There were a lot of antique stores on the side streets. Most of them didn't look open, but on one of them the door was unlocked when I pushed it, and there was an old woman inside sitting behind a counter, reading a large dictionary sized book spread open in front of her. I felt awkward because I wasn't going to buy anything, but it was even worse just to stand there in the doorway. So I smiled and walked around like I was interested in the old train lanterns and baby dolls in glass jars on the shelves. After a while, I heard a page turn and realized she wasn't paying attention to me anyway. There was a second, smaller room in the back which had more junk, much less organized. There was a stack of old photographs, some of them in a box, some of them scattered about. A few were of people, but most were old pictures of Tonopah, miners and mules in tents, women with flat, severe faces, a crowd of people, their faces white commas, watching an outdoor boxing match, parades and school bands, everyone lined up holding trombones and tubas, graduations, girls in white dresses, white bows in their hair, so gentle and beautiful they might have been another race entirely. A crazy eyed Serbian who'd murdered a lawyer and been executed in Carson City, priests leading Sunday school picnics, crowds filing through the streets after a line of coffins. When I was done, I went back outside and stood in the sunshine by the red clapboard wall, looking down the main street of the town. I didn't quite believe that everything I'd seen inside was connected to the town I was in now, that people I'd seen walking around last night might have known some of the people in those flat black and white pictures. I guess history is like that. I walked back towards the Mizpah. Mom was standing on the front steps as if she'd been waiting for me. "Did you have breakfast?" "Yes, I walked around some too." She looked up and down the street. "Anything to see?" "No, everything's closed." I didn't want to tell her about the pictures. I didn't think she'd understand. "Well, let's walk anyway," she said. She pulled out her scarf and tied it around her head, and we walked down the highway until we were almost out of town. I decided not to ask her about Mr. McGregor, to pretend it didn't bother me. Let her think I didn't care. I was wishing I'd grown up in Tonopah. Not the way it was today, but the Tonopah I'd just seen in pictures. Parades and dances and picnics, a clear past behind me and a future already written. All the great events we'd learned about in school, foretold and not very painful somehow, because everything turned out all right in the end. I thought maybe in some previous life I had lived in Tonopah. Maybe that was why I felt something special about it. Just at the edge of the town was a cemetery. It was marked off by a fence with a metal arch over the entrance. The ground inside around the graves was bare. The markers were just wooden slabs gone sideways, lettering chewed away by the wind. Beyond, the road stretched out flat across a hazy valley towards some faint blue mountains shiny with snow in the distance. Maybe out of some notion that a cemetery might be interesting, like the pictures in the antique store were, I turned off the road and walked under the arch. The first grave had a little metal marker on it, a name and a date, from something like 1911. The next one had the same date, and so did the next. I remembered some pictures labeled Belmont Mine Fire with a date from that year. That picture of crowds following the line of coffins was one of them. The next grave was also 1911, and then I began to not like the cemetery. I thought of those men down there in the dark, not far below my feet, and I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. Mom came up behind me. God takes in everybody, she said. She was untying her scarf and stuffing it in her jacket pocket. Even those who die in the dark. I always hate her saying things like that and having that look on her face. But I was relieved at that moment, and I could walk again. The ground was solid, and the men weren't right under my feet. I walked back towards the main path. I could see the town and the letters Ms. Pa across the roof of the hotel. On the way to town, Mom had told me Mizpah was from the Bible. It made me think of my father and Jewish names. I turned around and said to her, "Who was I named after?" She was catching up with me on the path, her face puzzled. She didn't quite answer, though she might have been going to. "Jewish people are always named after a relative who died. Didn't you tell me that?" I was sure she had. If she hadn't, I don't know where I would have heard it. "Yes," she said. "So who was I named after?" I was squeezing my hands together in my jacket pocket. I'd never asked something like that. Or maybe I had and she hadn't answered. She could just easily not answer this time. "There was another branch of the family," she said. "Your father's father came over here. I don't know when. It was long before I knew them, maybe in the 20s. But his siblings stayed over there." She didn't know anything about them really, which annoyed me. That was when she said they were Jewish, they were from Europe, they were rich. She thought Dad's grandfather owned factories. He made carpets, she thought, unless it was toys. Carpets or toys, you don't know? I heard both, she shrugged. Maybe they started with carpets and went into toys later. They never told me anything, you know. And I never asked. I didn't want to look stupid. Where did they come from? I don't know, someplace in Europe. She said Europe like it was a country. I never heard of it. She had her hands in her pockets, and the wind was blowing strands of her now loose hair around her face. We had walked back under the cemetery arch out towards the road. I walked slowly, hoping she would keep on talking. Her voice was comfortable, as if a rambling conversation between two people out in the open could be of no particular consequence. I'd learned over the years to pay attention to that comfortable voice, which sometimes turned up cleaning the house or on long car trips. You got little bits of information that way, little pieces of the puzzle that didn't exist. You weren't supposed to ask questions of this voice. You were just supposed to wait for whatever might be revealed. That was the reason for the comfort in the voice, the casualness that made it safe somehow to disclose information. "You don't know what they were like," she said. "They had fur coats, not just one, but a mink for this, a sable for that. All his aunts with their big pocketbooks waltzing about, shopping on Fifth Avenue. I thought they were rich. I thought they were like Rockefellers. They spoke languages, French and German and I don't know what, and they went to concerts and talked about composers and artists." I tried to picture Mom among people like that. I wondered, too, where Aunt Lorraine was hearing this. As far as I know, she's always lived with or near Mom. We got to the road and Mom turned towards the town so I couldn't see her face and said, "What I was going to tell you is the ones who stayed over there in Europe were killed by the Germans." There was something broken along the road, something made of boards which had collapsed, leaving bits of glass and little curlicued nails. I stepped carefully among the boards, trying not to trip. I knew what she meant, sort of. I knew the Germans killed Jews, and I'd heard people talk on TV about the camps. But there was always something unspecified about it. It was like people couldn't explain, or like it was too big to talk about. People didn't have the right words. Just the camps. Then Mom said for a long time after the war, they still didn't know what had happened to many people. Sometimes people who were supposed to be dead turned up alive. Others were still in camps, and to contact them or try to find out who had died, we wrote letters through the Red Cross. Apparently there was an argument about who to name me after, a cousin named Rachel, or, if I was a boy, Joel, which was my great-grandfather's name. Frankly, I was hoping you'd be a girl, Mom said. I mean, Joel. But didn't you get a choice? What could I do? It was their tradition. I tried to stay out of it. No one knew if Cousin Rachel had survived, so they wrote letters to the camps to Palestine, and eventually Mom said they got a letter from someone who survived, and he said that Cousin Rachel was... She didn't finish the sentence directly. She paused a long time, long enough that I looked at her, and then she said, "Dead." "That's not what you were going to say," I said. You were going to say something else. I didn't really know what it could be. What could be worse than just being dead? But when someone hesitates, you imagine the worst. Mom stood frowning at the ground. Her ears were red from the wind, and she was trying to pull her scarf back out of her pocket. He saw her in line for the gas, Mom said. No one who went that way came back. She looked up. 2 days after we got that letter, you were born. She began walking up the road ahead of me. I followed, my feet scrunching in the dirt and gravel alongside the pavement. I could see the buildings of Main Street, the Mizpah, and the fire department, and part of the Clapboard Museum. I didn't belong here. I could never have the secure past that I had seen in those pictures, the future all laid out for me. Here, in this little lost town, I had found out who I was forever.